Okay, guys, welcome to my screencast on the Puritans. So, let me say something before we even start talking about the Puritans. Uh, One question you might ask is why we're not doing a whole lot of time on Native American literature. Well, let me say one thing. Uh, as far as I know, most Native American literature was literate, so they weren't writing it down. A lot of it comes down eventually and is recorded stuff that they were using through oral tradition of telling each other stories. And eventually we have some recordings of that. But as far as written language, their cultures weren't focused on that. However, of course, when the English came, there were many different uh, colonizing groups from Europe. But when the English came, since we're studying English, they brought with them, of course, an established written language. Now, there are different colonizers from England. If you go as early as Jamestown, that's a little bit before the Puritans. But I like to start with, we don't have a ton of time to go into every single group. And the Puritans are very important when it comes to establishing some literary and philosophical traditions. So we're going to start there. We're not going to spend a ton of time in the colonial period because we got a lot to cover. And to be honest, this is not always the most interesting section for students, even though it can be quite fascinating. So the Puritans, let's talk about who they are. Most of you are familiar a little bit with them just from, the traditions of Thanksgiving, but they're a pretty interesting group. So let's start. I'll give you a basic overview of them. So Puritan, some people think it is a name that they use because they were so religious that they acted in a very pure way. However, that's not exactly what the beginning of the word was. Puritan, you can see here, is a broad term referring to a number of Protestant groups that beginning about 1560 sought to purify the Church of England, hence the name Puritan. So, some of these people are pretty radical religiously. What had happened was, if we're going all the way down to the early 1500s, or even all the way back to the beginning of Christianity, there was a church, a Christian church. And eventually it got the name the Catholic Church. Catholic means universal, the one and only church. And there was a split that happened into Eastern Orthodoxy. We're not really going to talk about that because it doesn't have a lot to do with what we're dealing with here. But another big split that happened was in the early 1500s when you had the Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestants, they looked at the Catholic Church and they saw a lot of corruptions because the Catholic Church had become such a big, powerful institution. They saw where people were, being told that if they gave them money, it could shave off some years in purgatory or hell. So they saw some corruptions there. They saw a lot of people in the church obsessed a lot more with making money than saving souls. And in general, most Protestants at that time wanted to simplify Christianity back to how it used to be before there was all this built up amount of church tradition. And they didn't think that a lot of the stuff the Catholics did was actually from the Bible. So they were very critical of the Catholics. It was a huge, big deal. I mean, the Catholic leaders wanted to go to war to a certain degree with the people that started Protestantism. But eventually it became a really big force in Europe, reached all the way to England. Now, in England, you had a king named Henry VIII. And Henry VIII, he had a thing he liked to do, which was divorce wives or get rid of wives. Why? Well, he was trying to get a male son, an heir to the throne, have a baby boy. And many of his wives were unable, they'd get pregnant, but they'd have girls. And he wanted a son. So he'd find different reasons to get rid of them and get a new wife. Sometimes he'd accuse them of crimes and they would be executed. Other times he would get a divorce. Now, in the Catholic tradition at that time, if you wanted to get a divorce and you were somebody like the king, you had to get permission from the church. And from him, he had to get permission from the Pope in order to get a divorce and therefore get another wife. And this is making a long story kind of simple, but at one point, the Pope said, no, you're doing this too much. He said, can I get another wife? Can I get divorced from this one? He said, no. And he goes, well, you know what? I've been looking at these Protestants. They don't listen to you. They do whatever they want. So how about I make all of England Protestant? In fact, I'm going to do that. We're Protestant now. And you know what? You know who the head of the church is? It's not you anymore, Pope. It's me, King Henry VIII, head of the Church of England is what we'll call it. So he did that, but instead of like making all these big changes that Protestants wanted to do with the religion, he pretty much just took the Catholic sign off the church, put Protestant, and kept everything the same. So the Puritans come along and they say, no, 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 you're still being too Catholic. You need to change things. That's what Protestantism is all about. That makes the king mad. The Puritans don't know what to do because they're not, let's see, I'm freezing on the ScreenCast here. You know, they're not being listened to, and in fact, they start to be persecuted. So that's their big thing, trying to purify the Church of England from traces of Catholicism. We'll get into what happens to them. I know I just gave you a big old history lesson, but I had to kind of explain it. So Puritans wanted, can I move myself here? Whoa. There, we'll go right here. Puritans wanted to get rid of any traces of Catholicism in the Church of England. So they're Protestant. They're not Catholic anymore, and they wanted to make sure that was obvious. They thought that Christian worship and church organization should be simplified in order to resemble biblical models. So they wanted to change the way they ran church in England. They wanted to purify it. That's where the name comes from. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the Puritan theology so you kind of understand these guys a little bit more. But so Puritans believed, if you don't know the story of Adam and Eve, in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis, God creates the world. He creates people, and he creates a garden for them, and he puts Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, in the Garden of Eden. They get tempted. He says, you can do anything you want, but don't eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is one tree you're not allowed to eat from, or bad things will happen to you. And then you get the serpent. Here you see, here you see the serpent is like a man serpent, but it could have been a snake. It doesn't say in the story, but it says a serpent. The serpent tricks them, or at least tempts them, to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do that, and they sinned for the first time, angering God. And Puritans believed we all inherited that sin. So that's called original sin, if you've ever heard that term, and that it had damned most people for all eternity to hell. Most people, because of Adam and Eve's sin, are damned. They're going to hell. But they also believed that people had been saved from going to hell by Jesus Christ. So Jesus was the Son of God, God incarnate, and he was sent to earth to save people. But here's the Puritan idea: only particular people, who are known as the elect. So this brings out about the idea known as predestination, which means before you were even born, you were predestined to either be part of the elect and saved or not. So it kind of makes people freak out a little bit because they didn't know what they were. It's a little bit of a different theology than other theologies, which might have a little more wiggle room for who gets to go to heaven. The Puritans said Jesus made that decision, or he only died for a few people. And guess what? They think for the most part it's them because they're doing things according to the right ways of church, they think. All right. So because of all this, it was difficult to know for certain if one was saved or damned. So the Puritans tried to, live out their lives in a way that would demonstrate their salvation. So what you get through a lot of it is you get people that end up being pretty paranoid about hell and damnation and judgment. Let's move my camera. Whoa. Okay. Couple other things to know is Puritans believed that you are saved only by God's grace. That means God comes and saves you. There's nothing you can do to earn your salvation. God just chooses you as one of the elect and saves you. Now, how do you know if you've been saved? Well, they say you would have had some kind of intense emotional experience of this grace. And the term they also use is born again. It's something from the Bible that Jesus talks about. So they believed that to a certain degree, there's nothing you can do. You're wicked. Just like Adam and Eve, you're a sinner, but God can come down and save you. So that's something else that they were really hoping for and praying for, was to be saved by God. So as we get Puritans, now we're kind of talking about the Puritans that come to America. I'll talk about why they did in a minute, but they start to build a society in America, and they have some kind of values that start to be associated with them. Stuff like self-reliance, industriousness, temperance, and simplicity. It kind of is reflected that they want a real simple way of worship, but they tended to be simple, kind of tough people that were reliant only on themselves. Especially they couldn't rely on the government, who's saying, hey, stop telling us how to do church. They had to read the Bible themselves and figure things out themselves. And we get a lot of what start to become American ideals here. I mean, self-reliance is a big American ideal, that idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and, rags to riches. Starts to come out of some of the Puritan values as well. So anyway, going back to England with what was going on with the Puritans, the Puritans were starting to what's the word I'm looking for? Experience a lot of persecution by the English government. So it says here, Puritans' disagreement with the Church of England's organizations, political ties, and methods of worship caused them to be victims of persecution. If you start telling a king what he should do, the king will start doing whatever he wants to you. That's what kings do. They don't have to listen to whether or not it's the Constitution. They didn't have a Constitution. So anyway, they start to be persecuted. I think I have a Harry Potter guy. There we go. He looked kind of like a Puritan to me, and he looks a little bit aghast at what's happening with these types of persecution. But the Puritans were jailed, fined money just for being Puritans, whipped. Their noses were slit, like cut up their noses. They were branded with hot irons, and the tops of their ears were cut off. This happened in some cases. So heavy persecution because of their religious beliefs. And so a lot of them decided to come to the new world that had been just discovered and started to get settled in America. So many of them fled England, some of whom ended up in North America. And these were like the gnarliest ones. Sometimes they call them the separatists. They weren't staying in England saying, let's work things out, guys. They're like, we're out of here. We're doing what we want to do. We don't need any of you. And they ended up going to North America. And these first ones that left are known as, to us today, it is the Pilgrims. So this is the group. We're going to read some William Bradford. He was one of the Pilgrims. He came over on the Mayflower. You've heard of the Mayflower. And this is the first group of Puritans, and we're going to read a little bit of them. That's why I'm giving you so much background. And these were the most hardcore of them. They're like, we're not going to do anything that we don't think goes with our religious beliefs. We're going to leave the country because we're being oppressed here. There's a lot of Puritans that do stay and try to work with the government. Eventually, Puritans actually take over England, but that's in a little bit. So some ideas of what Puritans thought of America. I think this is important to understand. So Puritans in America. I think that this is still an active thing in American thought in some places. But when Puritans first arrived in North America, they compared themselves to the children of Israel, which were depicted in the Old Testament and the Bible, a group set apart by God, surrounded by wilderness, danger, and savages. So if you know the book of Exodus, you have the people of Israel. All right, these are the Jewish people, the Hebrews, the main focus of the Old Testament of the Bible. And they go to Egypt. It's a long story, but they end up all settled in Egypt because there's famines that drove them there. And then there's a Pharaoh in Egypt that starts persecuting them because they are Israelites. They end up escaping. This is the story of the Exodus with Moses and the 10 plagues and parting of the Red Sea. They end up escaping, but they get out not right into the promised land, but into the wilderness, the desert that's dangerous. And eventually they have to take the promised land, but they have to take it from all these savage tribes like the Canaanites that they have to fight against in order to take the land that's theirs. This is all the story in the Old Testament. But the Puritans said, that sounds just like us. We were persecuted in England like they were persecuted in Egypt. We went out into the wilderness on our boat and got to America, which was completely, uninhabited other than by savages, we'll see, and according to them. And they're in a place of danger, but they've arrived at the promised land that they have to settle. And if they have to fight off other people, meaning the Native Americans, then they will. And just like the Israelites had to fight off the people that lived in, the promised land. So they start saying, we are God's chosen people, just like the Israelites were. And this is a heavy theme throughout American belief, that they are chosen and set apart by God. And we can see this kind of developing, especially with the Puritans. These savages, of course, are the Native Americans. I say savages because to them, they would have thought they were people without civilization, and they would have been quite strange. Now, the first Puritans, like Bradford that we read about, got along kind of okay with the Native Americans, but the more Puritans that come over, we start having wars between the two groups, and it gets pretty gnarly. But you can see the difference between the two societies. Talking about that idea of God's chosen people, I want to read you this quote from John Winthrop, who was leading his people over. He was a little bit later than the Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower, but this was his vision of what the Puritan settlements in the New World should be. And he said this: "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." So we have this idea first of a city on a hill. Now, it'll be adopted by some speakers in American history as meaning we'll be America number one, because we're the big city on the hill. But he's saying it more that everybody will be able to see us, a city on a hill, and then look and see whether or not we're successful. And if we're not, we'll see that in the later part of the quote, if we're not, then we will be, when he says being made a story and a byword, like they'll make a joke out of us, meaning the pressure's on, guys. But we get this idea of what they call American exceptionalism, of this city on a hill. Like, people are going to be watching us. If we pull this off, we'll be the best. But if we don't, then we'll be a joke. So this was early Puritan thought. Okay, so before we get into a little bit about their writing, and we're almost done, but just a quick quote. This comes from one of my American Lit textbooks, but some Puritan contributions to American culture and history. So the Puritan belief in a spiritual compact between God and humanity, this idea of being chosen by God, kind of paved the way for American constitutional democracy, about having like a constitution, a compact. And then finally, the Puritans emphasized education so that people could read and understand the Bible and follow religious debates. This is like the 1600s, and the Puritan colonies have like a 90% plus literacy rate, which was huge. The big thing is the big thing about the Protestants and the Puritans especially is they said you need to not listen to a priest about what God is saying through the Bible. You got to read it yourself. And so you need to learn how to read. So they were big on education. A lot of people see this as kind of setting up a lot of what Americans value in the future. So let's talk about their writing. We're going to read a little bit of their writing. And so here's some things to know about it. Number one, the Bible was there. They didn't read a lot of novels or poetry. They read the Bible a lot. And so that provided a main model for their writing. Their writing sounds pretty biblical when you read it. This is around the time it's the Geneva Bible, and eventually the King James Bible will be coming out soon. But you can kind of sound like you're reading an old version of the Bible. And as I was talking about the way they kind of compared themselves to the people of Israel, you'll see that a lot where they see direct connections between biblical or even just supernatural events in their own lives. There's a constant intervening of God and the supernatural in what's going on in their daily lives. When most Puritans themselves would write, usually it was kind of a way of writing about what's going on in their lives in order for them to explore what God's doing in their lives. So it says to explore their inner and outer lives for signs of God and his working in their lives. And the most common forms that we get are diaries and histories. You don't get a lot of poetry. There is some. Anne Bradstreet is a great Puritan poet. But for the most part, the most common forms were like these nonfiction autobiographical, because they don't want to get too flowery and use a bunch of similes and poetic language. They'd think that's kind of, the temptation of the devil for you to start using your imagination and lose touch with what God is doing. And so what they used instead was what they would call the plain style. This is similar to the Geneva Bible they had at the time, which stressed just being straightforward, clarity of expression, and avoiding complicated figures of speech or like poetic devices. Now, that's not necessarily the case when we talk about their sermons. There are some sermons that are quite poetic and vivid. A lot of times they use a lot of rich imagery and metaphors so that they can really get you to understand what God is doing, and often sometimes why God is really angry at you. But no matter what, the baseline is this. All Puritan writing, whether it's some amount of poetry we have, like Anne Bradstreet or Wigglesworth, whether it's sermons by people like Cotton Mather or later Jonathan Edwards, or if it's histories like the William Bradford will read, all of these were written to glorify God and what he was doing. So a heavy, heavy presence of their religious belief in everything they do. And so we'll kind of want to wonder, this kind of writing and thinking and philosophy, how did it affect what the American mind in general would be in the future? All right, guys, that's it.